Hello everyone, I'm Jen and I make useful English Lit study videos on Shakespeare, poetry, fiction, literary ideas and more to help you become a literary expert. So if that sounds like exactly what you need, then make sure you hit the subscribe button below. In today's video, I'm doing an overview of the three main approaches to literary analysis. Now, if you've been watching this channel, then chances are you already have done quite a lot of literary analysis already, which basically just means reading a text in a detailed way with the goal of looking for deeper meaning. Reading between the lines. But there are many different approaches to reading between the lines in the context of literary analysis, and in general, they include close reading, contextual reading, and theoretical reading. Close reading means analyzing a text based only on information given in the text. So we're really looking only at the text's language, form, and structure, without caring about anything else, like the author's personal or historical background. And this is why close reading is also known as textualism or essentialism, because we're only focusing on what's essential, most important, in literary analysis, which is, of course, the text itself. On the other hand, contextual reading means reading the text with an awareness of its historical background, i.e., we're asking the question of how the actual historical events, socio-political conditions, and cultural trends at the author's time could have influenced their writing. Hence, the technical term for this kind of contextual reading approach is also known as historicism. Take a novel like William Golding's Lord of the Flies, for example. Simply close reading it, we'd view the novel as a cautionary tale about not letting children or humans roam wild without governance, law and order, because human nature is brutish in its essence. But if we were to apply contextual reading to our analysis, we'd see the novel as also being a political allegory for the dangers of totalitarian leadership, which is a phenomenon that played out in Nazi Germany and fascist Italy during World War II, when Golding, serving in the British Royal Navy, would have witnessed firsthand the dark atrocities of humanity unleashed by warfare. So at GCSE level, most students will be asked to do both close and contextual reading, but as students move up to A level and beyond at university, they are also required to bring in theoretical reading, which essentially means applying literary theory to the process of analysing texts. Some of you will be familiar with theoretical approaches like feminist, psychoanalytical, and Marxist reading. And in fact, I've also done quite a few videos applying these theoretical approaches to textual analysis, which you can check out here. So literary theory is a tricky subject because there are helpful and unhelpful ways of using theory for reading. And I've noticed that students often get confused about how they should use theory, when it's appropriate to use theory, and how much theory they really need without letting it overshadow their own voice in the analysis. And often the answer is way less, way less than you think. So I'll go into detail about what it means to use theory in helpful and unhelpful ways later, but for now, just know that the higher the level of literary studies you do, the more theory you'll most likely need to engage with. And whether that's something I agree with or not is a separate point, but there you go. That's a general rule of thumb to remember. So with that, let's dive straight into a breakdown of each of these three types of reading approaches. Now, as mentioned earlier, close reading literally means looking at a text closely, focusing on nothing else but the words on the page for messages and meaning. This is an approach for the detail-oriented people. So if you're into scrutinizing and examining the nitty-gritty in things, then this approach would probably come naturally to you. Because close reading views the text as a self-contained object and places so much weight on localized observations like specific words, poetry tends to work best with this approach, as a poem is often much shorter than something with an extended narrative like a novel or a play or even a short story. So in order to do close reading well, you need to be super familiar with literary techniques or devices and be able to spot them in a text accurately and draw associations between the techniques and the ideas that are conveyed through the words, sounds, and form. Now, some of these techniques you most probably have come across in your literature lessons, if not in plenty of my videos, like diction, imagery, simile, metaphor, personification, or sound devices like alliteration, rhyme, assonance, etc., or structural devices like parallelism, anaphora, chiasmus, you name it. So in any case, the idea is to look at the text as a linguistic work of art and to observe and savor its construction by considering how each element in the text contributes to a central theme and idea. It's possible to apply close reading to analysing novels and plays as well, but usually it would be a specific passage taken from the wider text. So your analysis would be focused more on the language and stylistics of the author's writing, rather than the narrative and structural implications of the passage in the work at large. So in general, I find that applying close reading to prose works best with writing that tends towards the poetic and elaborate. For instance, something like Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway or the American author John Updike's novels, because Updike writes with such stylistic flourish and poetic flair, which I really recommend that you check out if you're not familiar with him. So anyway, if a passage features a lot of dialogue, or if it's written in a much more austere and sparse style, then I found that applying close reading can be a more challenging exercise, but that might come differently to you. Now, historically, close reading is nothing new. Back when Shakespeare was studying at grammar school, he was already analysing classical literary texts with a detailed eye on the rhetorical techniques employed by Homer, Ovid, Virgil. If we consider that there are hundreds upon hundreds of Greek and Latin terms for figurative devices, then it's really unsurprising that a literary analysis approach which emphasizes the use of language and style was so dominant back in the Renaissance. But close reading only became properly institutionalized as an approach to literary analysis with the rise of the English university degree in the 1920s, beginning with the Cambridge School, including figures like William Empson, whose book 7 Types of Ambiguity pretty much typified the methodology, as well as founding Cambridge English professors like F.R. Leavis and I.A. Richards, championing close reading as the best approach to textual analysis, which subsequently also became adopted as the de facto method to teaching literature at English secondary schools, which is pretty much still reflected in GCSE and A-level curricula today. Now, across the Atlantic, close reading gained popularity at around the same time with professors in the American South like Clem Brooks, John Crowe Ransom, and W.K. Wimsatt, who justified this formalist practice with the idea that because the author's intended messaging can never truly be known, it's much more rewarding to create meaning for the reader by purely focusing on the end product, i.e. the text itself, rather than trying to draw any associations between the author and their work. Now, this idea is also known as intentional fallacy. But what I want to stress is that considering what the author might have intended with their works based on their biography isn't actually a wrong approach per se, but the emphasis is the word might. So it's okay to infer possible connections between the author's life and their works. In fact, it would be pretty weird not to, as long as you're not making an absolute claim about whatever links you are making in your analysis. So the next approach is contextual reading, or historicist reading. Contrary to close reading, a contextual approach requires that we read with an awareness that the text is a socially determined and influenced object, and that it does not exist in its own vacuum. According to a historicist logic, then, if a poem was written in wartime, then it's very likely that the emotions and ideas conveyed in the poem would have been informed by the author's experience or view of warfare, even if the poem doesn't really talk about war explicitly as its topic. Another example is to consider the length of a novel. Have you ever noticed how a lot of Victorian novels are super long? Just think Dickens' Great Expectations, Eliot's Middlemarch, or Thackeray's Vanity Fair, which is super thick, right? Henry James even had a nickname for them as these loose, baggy monsters. And it wasn't just because the authors had a lot to say in their books, but in Victorian England, novels were actually serialized publications, and that instead of publishing an entire book in one go, authors would release chapters and episodes of their work in newspapers on a weekly basis. Naturally then, that gave authors a commercial incentive to keep writing and writing and writing, right? So you see, had we not known about this particular nature of the Victorian English publishing landscape, our analysis of Dickens, Eliot's, and Thackeray's novels would probably be rather different. By the way, guys, if you find this video helpful so far, I'd massively appreciate it if you could hit the thumbs up button below and subscribe to my channel so that you don't miss out on any of my top grade lit study content going forward. I'd also encourage you to check out my membership program by clicking the join button below if you want exclusive access to members only study content and make special video requests. I'll see you there. Personally, I agree that no text was ever written without at least some degree of conscious or subconscious influence by the author's individual and social conditions, and that if we chose to read a text purely in terms of the words on the page, we're really limiting the possible scope of interpretation that we can bring to a given literary work. Of course, the extent to which we need to acknowledge the real biographical or historical circumstances surrounding a text can vary from significantly for maybe a social novel like Elizabeth Gaskell's North and South to minimal for a short imagist poem like William Carlos Williams' The Red Wheelbarrow, for example. But in any case, a more balanced and comprehensive approach to reading a text for meaning would probably be a hybrid one, where we first engage with the text as it is presented on the page, the close reading approach, and then zoom out to consider the broader historical conditions and trends that might have informed the author's writing process, which is the contextual approach. Now, a major school of criticism associated with historicism is New Historicism, which began in the 1980s with Stephen Greenblatt, a Shakespearean scholar who emphasized the historical situatedness of literary works, in particular the way in which the production of a text is the result of a complex web of power, political, and social dynamics. So if you read Stephen Greenblatt's scholarship, you'll notice that he often begins by narrating a specific historical anecdote that's seemingly unrelated to the literary text, but then eventually he'll map out the links to illustrate that literature and history are inextricably intertwined, so much so that sometimes you'll get the impression that literary works are just historical documents by another name. Now, one takeaway from Greenblatt's historicist approach is the emphasis that he places on political power as a lever for literary production, which makes sense for his specific area of specialism, which is Shakespeare and Renaissance literature, because authors back in Renaissance England were deeply socialized characters whose livelihoods were often dependent on aristocratic patronage and popular reception. For example, consider that two of Shakespeare's biggest patrons included James I, who was the king, as well as the incredibly wealthy Henry Wriothesley, the third Earl of Southampton. So while it's hard to deny that politics does often factor into literary writing, there are definitely periods in texts where using such a pronounced socio-political framework to reading a text may not be so necessary or even rewarding at all. For instance, with something more lyrical like Robert Frost or John Keats' poetry, you don't really need to know too much about what happens socially or politically in Keats or Frost's time to be able to deeply appreciate their poems. Now, finally, there is theoretical reading, which basically means reading a text from an angle that is informed by a particular political or cultural agenda. Some of the more common theoretical frameworks are feminism, Marxism, post-colonialism, and psychoanalysis. And in recent years, others like queer theory and eco-criticism have gained prominence, especially in more liberal English departments. Then there are the French-influenced theories like structuralism and deconstructionism, which focus more on the limitations of human language as a mode of true expression, but frankly I'm not a huge fan of applying these ideas to literary analysis because I feel that the sheer conceptual density of these theories per se pretty much hijack the primary focus of literary interpretation, which should really be on the literary text itself, not the philosophical theory. So my bottom line is that theory is only ever useful for literary analysis if it opens up a new, illuminating way for readers to understand the text's ideas. But if it doesn't do that, or at least if we can't get it to do that for us, then the theory is virtually irrelevant to the study of literature. So the reason that frameworks like feminism, Marxism, post-colonialism, and psychoanalysis are helpful for literary interpretation is because these concepts embody what's already a prominent idea presented in the literary text. So what do I mean by that? For instance, it makes sense to apply feminist theory to something like Carol Ann Duffy's poems or Kate Chopin's novel The Awakening, because things like womanhood and feminism are the key themes in Duffy and Chopin's works. Likewise, it's useful to apply Marxist theory to a lot of Charles Dickens or even Jane Austen's novels, because the notion of social class and hierarchy is so central to these authors' and narrative worlds. So anyway, the point that I'm making here is that whatever literary theory we choose to read a text by, we just need to first assess whether it's appropriate for and aligned with the ideas that the text is already presenting, and that we're not just forcing or shoehorning any high-sounding theory onto literature, even when there's no benefit to doing so. Also, know that whatever literary theory you pick as an analytical lens, you have chosen to read the text in a specific and therefore narrower purview, which of course isn't a problem itself as long as you can justify the appropriateness of matching the theory with the text. So remember, theory is never the point. The literary work is, and simply using theory doesn't make your analysis more sophisticated. Often, it could make your writing more convoluted and hard to understand if you don't finesse it well. So only use it if you have a clear understanding of the theory to begin with, and that you see an appropriate link between the theory that you've chosen and the text that you're analyzing. And there you have it, guys. These are the three main approaches to analyzing any literary text: close reading, contextual reading, and theoretical reading. In fact, I think I've covered all of the possible approaches. These are pretty broad umbrella approaches under which you see a lot of sub-approaches, right, that I've mentioned throughout the video, with the exception of maybe, well, leisurely reading, which is basically not really bothering with reading for deep meaning. And sometimes leisurely reading is the best approach to reading because, well, not everything has to be so deep all the time, after all. But anyway, I hope this was helpful for you in terms of giving you a clear, systematic way of thinking about how you can and might want to approach your literary texts so that you can use an approach that you personally find most appealing and, of course, adopt them based on the different types of texts that you encounter throughout your studies. For my next video, I recommend that you watch my explainer on what is literary theory, where I go deeper into the topic and discuss how you can use theory in useful ways for your own literary analysis. And as always, hit that thumbs up button below if you found this video helpful in any way so that the YouTube algorithm can spread it to other passionate lit learners like yourself and that you can encourage me to keep making useful lit content for you in the future. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to my channel and switch on that bell notification so you don't miss out on my future weekly videos. You can also consider joining my membership program if you want to make exclusive video requests or essay review perks, and you can click that join button below to find out more. Thank you for watching as always, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!